Good day everyone, my name is Loreto Atamosa, your instructor for microeconomics, and in today's video, we will talk about the concept of elasticity. Welcome to the fourth lesson of our course, Microeconomics. In this lesson, we will focus on how elasticities are used to measure the responsiveness of the demand for a good to the change in the determinants of demand over time. And so at the end of this video discussion, you guys should be able to explain the concept of price elasticity of demand and its computation, explain the concept of income elasticity of demand and its computation, to explain the concept of elasticity of supply and its computation, to explain why time is an important determinant of price elasticity of supply, and also to apply the concept of price elasticity of supply to the labor supply curve. We're ready, let's start! So, you may have wondered why there are goods that you purchase more when price becomes less, or you purchase less if the price is more, while there are goods that even if the prices become too high, become low, still you purchase the same quantity of that good. So if you have asked yourself why and to try to look for an answer, you actually are trying to explain the concept of elasticity. So in this chapter, you will learn the meaning of elasticity. You will also learn why this concept is very important to our everyday decision making as a consumer. And so first, let's revisit the law of demand. So it tells us that we will buy more of a good or service if the price declines and less when the price goes up. But how much more or less of a good or service will you buy given the change in price? So the amount varies from product to product and over different price ranges for the same product. It may also vary over time, and such variations matter. Of course, in order to answer the question, economists have developed the concept of elasticity to explain how consumers respond to changes in the factors that affect demand. So you may have first encountered the term elasticity in your physics subject, which refers to the expansion or contraction of physical matter such as rubber. But in economics, however, elasticity means responsiveness or sensitivity. So in general, elasticity is the ratio of the percent change in one variable to the percent change in another variable. It is a tool used by economists to measure the reaction of a function to changes in the parameters in a relative way. And so, demand elasticity in particular is a measure of the degree of responsiveness of quantity demanded of a product to a given change in one of the independent variables which affect demand for that product. So we can classify demand elasticity according to factors that cause the change. We have price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, and cross-price elasticity of demand. When we say price elasticity of demand, it is the responsiveness of consumers' demand to change in price and the goods sold, while income elasticity of demand is the responsiveness of consumers' demand to a change in their income. And so, cross-price elasticity of demand is the responsiveness of demand for a certain good in relation to changes in price of another related goods. Let us try to have a deeper understanding of these factors one by one. First, we have price elasticity of demand. So when we speak of the price elasticity of demand, we are dealing with the sensitivity of quantities both by a consumer to change in the product price. Therefore, this concept described in an action that is within the producer's control. And so the formula would look like this. Elasticity of demand equals to percentage change in the quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. And so we can therefore define price elasticity of demand as the percentage change in quantity demanded by a 1% change in price. So you may have observed that the most common method used by economists in textbooks in the measurement of price elasticity of demand is the arc elasticity. And the formula for this indicator would look like this. where elasticity of price is equal to coefficient of arc price elasticity or elasticity coefficient. Q1 refers to original quantity demanded, Q2 refers to new quantity demanded, P1 represents to the original price, and P2 refers to the new price. So the numerator of this coefficient would look like this. It indicates the percentage change in the quantity demanded, and the denominator would look like this. It indicates the percentage change in the price. So you guys can also refer to your module for some examples where the arc elasticity formula was utilized. So as you may have observed, the computed value of the price elasticity is always negative. Although when we analyze and interpret the coefficient, we ignore the negative sign, thus only the absolute value is interpreted. What could be the reason for this? It is always negative due to the very nature of relationship of price and quantity demanded. If price increases, less quantity of good is demanded. Therefore, quantity change is negative, leading to a negative price elasticity of demand. Conversely, if price falls, this negative value will lead to a negative price elasticity of demand value. And so, for economists, solving the elasticity coefficient is only a tool rather than an end itself. What is important to them, and to you also, is to understand the meaning of the computed elasticity coefficient. So our concern now is how to analyze and interpret the elasticity coefficient. Actually, there are only certain rules to remember in analyzing and interpreting the elasticity coefficient, as you will note in this following discussion. So demand for a product is said to be inelastic if consumers will pay almost any price for the product. So inelastic demand means that a producer or seller can raise prices without much hurting demand for its product, while demand for the product may be elastic if consumers will only have to pay a certain price or a narrow range of prices for the product. Elastic demand means that consumers are sensitive to the price at which a product is sold and will only buy it if the price rises by what they consider too much. And now, we already know that the fall in the price of a good results in an increase in the quantity demanded by consumers. However, the demand for a good is inelastic when the change in quantity demanded is less than the change in price. Thus, we can say that the demand is inelastic if a computed elasticity coefficient is less than 1. And so, generally, goods and services for which there are no close substitute are inelastic. Basic food items like rice, pork, beef, fish, and even vegetables. Medicines like antibiotics and oil products are some examples of goods that are inelastic. So goods that are vices like cigarettes are likewise inelastic, for the simple reason that those who smoke cannot easily refrain from smoking, so that even if the price of cigarettes has been increasing, still smokers consume them. And so let's proceed with income elasticity of demand. Income elasticity of demand measures the degree to which consumers respond to a change in their incomes by purchasing more or less of a product or good. So the coefficient of income elasticity of demand is determined with this formula. So that's income elasticity equals to percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income. So in discussing income elasticity of demand, we have to distinguish a normal good from an inferior good. And so normally, you would expect that when our percent change in income goes up, that the same thing would happen to our percent change in quantity demanded. For example, let's say we're talking about market of vacations. Well, as my income or as most people's income go up, they might be able to afford larger or better vacations, and that would be a normal good. This is a situation of a normal good. So normal good just as what you would expect, but you could actually have the other way around. You could imagine a situation where even though you have an increase in your percent change in income, that does not lead to an increase in your percent change in quantity demanded. In fact, it could lead to a decrease in percent change in quantity demanded. Or another way of thinking about it, your quantity demanded could actually go down. So you would have a negative percent change right over here. So now you could imagine any situation like that. Well, imagine if we're talking about the market of car mechanic services. So as people have more income, they might be able to afford better cars that are more reliable, that break down less. And then they would have to go to car mechanic less. And so that situation where our demand would actually go down when our income goes up, or our percent change will become negative when we have a positive percent change in income. That is known as an inferior good. Now, you already know that the law of demand says there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So if price goes up for a product, people buy less. And if the price goes down, people buy more. But the question now is how much less or how much more they would buy. And that's the idea of elasticity. Elasticity shows how sensitive quantity is to a change in price. What means to quantity when there's a change in price depends a lot on the type of product. So let's try to put this into graph illustration. First, we're going to talk about the idea of inelastic. So let's talk about gasoline. Gasoline has inelastic demand. This means when there's an increase in the price of the gasoline itself, the quantity demanded decreases, but just a little bit. So when the demand is inelastic, the quantity is insensitive to change in price. And it goes the other direction when the price falls. The quantity demanded goes up just a little bit. So when the price goes down, you buy a little bit more. But when the price goes up, you buy a little bit less, insensitive to a change in price, right? So the reason for this is because products that have inelastic demand have very few substitutes. Just like gasoline, there's nothing else we can use as substitute. How about elastic? Elastic, that means quantity is sensitive to change in price. So right here, when the price goes up, the quantity decreases a whole lot. And when the price goes down, the quantity demand goes up a whole lot. So when the demand is elastic, it means that these products have many substitutes, or they're luxuries, or they have elasticity coefficient. And at the extremes, demand can be perfectly price inelastic. That is, price changes have no effect at all on quantity demanded. So a perfectly priced inelastic demand curve is illustrated as a straight vertical line. Thus, as the figure illustrates, even if price will increase by more than 100%, still the amount of the good that will be bought will be the same. An example of a good that may be perfectly inelastic is a medicine for cancer patient. And on the other hand, demand can be perfectly price elastic. That is, any amount will be demanded only at the prevailing price. However, if the price will increase by even a minuscule amount of a very small percentage, consumers will not anymore purchase the good. A perfectly elastic demand curve illustrated as a straight horizontal line. An example of a good that may be perfectly elastic is a trip to outer space. And so, what determines elasticity? There are important factors that influence demand elasticity, including ease of substitution, proportion of total expenditures, durability of product, which may include possibility of postponing purchase, possibility of repair, and used product market, including length of time period. And so accordingly, the most important determinant of elasticity of a product is ease of substitution. So if there are many good substitutes for the product sold in the market, elasticity for the product will be high. Moreover, if the product itself is a good substitute for other goods, its demand elasticity will also be high. However, the broader the definition of commodity, the lower its price elasticity will tend to become because there is less opportunity for substitute. And lastly, as markets broaden, more and more product substitution becomes possible. Advances in mode of transportation and communication accompanied by decrease in their cost have increased the size of market over time. And so, consequently, the number of substitutes competing for consumers' demand has increased. In fact, markets have not only widened on a national scale, they have crossed national borders brought about by increase in international trade due to mainly to international agreements like the World Trade Organization and other regional trade blocs like the ASEAN, free trade agreements among ASEAN members countries and Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Now let's proceed with cross-price elasticity. So we already noted in previous discussion that the demand for a particular product also depends in part of the prices of related goods, substitutes, and complements. So the cross-price elasticity of demand measures the responsiveness of demand to change in the price of other goods, indicating how much more or less of a particular product is purchased as to the other prices change. So the cross elasticity is defined as the percentage change in the quantity demanded of one good, or the X, divided by the percentage change in the price of a related good, or the Y. Therefore, the formula for cross-price elasticity of demand would look like this. And so that's the cross-price elasticity is equals to percentage change in the quantity demanded of X over percentage change in the price of Y. Now, as we have noted, two goods are considered substitutes if there is a positive relationship between the quantity demanded of one good and the price of the other good. For example, an increase in the price of bananas increased the demand for mangoes as consumers substitute mangoes for bananas. For a more specific example, suppose the price of a burger falls by 10% and the demand for pizza decreased by 5%. So the cross-price elasticity of demand for pizza would respect to the price of burger, and it would look like this. And so the cross-price elasticity of demand for a substitute is positive. So a fall in the price of a substitute good brings forth a decrease in the quantity demanded of the good. In other words, the quantity demanded of a good and the price of one of its substitute change in the same direction. Now, suppose that when the price of Coke falls by 10% and the quantity of pizza demanded increased by 2%. So the cross elasticity of demand for pizza with respect to the price of Coke, and it would look like this. So the two goods are considered complements if there is a negative relationship between the quantity demanded of one good and the price of the other good. Hence, the cross-price elasticity of demand for a complement is negative. A fall in the price of a complement brings forth an increase in the quantity demanded of the other good. In other words, the quantity demanded of a good and the price of one its complements change in opposite direction. And so, estimates of cross elasticity of demand are useful to retailers in their pricing decisions. For example, when a grocery store cuts the price of bread, the store will sell more bread but will also sell more complementary goods such as jelly, peanut butter, cheese, and ham. So if the cross elasticity of demand for jelly is 0.50, a 10% decrease in the price of bread will increase the demand for jelly by 5%. So retailers use coupons for one product to promote the sales of that good as well as its complementary goods. So armed with the relevant cross elasticities, retailers can predict just how much more of a complementary good consumer will buy. Now let's proceed with elasticity of supply. Supply elasticity refers to the reaction or response of the sellers or producers to price change of goods sold. In other words, it is a measure of the degree of responsiveness of supply to a given change in price. Moreover, it is the percentage change in the quantity supplied given a percent change in price. Therefore, elasticity of supply is equal to percentage change in quantity supplied over percentage change in price. And so here's a video presentation from MR University to discuss the supply elastic and supply inelastic.
The elasticity of supply measures how responsive the quantity supplied is to a change in the price. So it's almost the same as the elasticity of demand, except instead of measuring the responsiveness of the quantity demanded, it measures the responsiveness of the quantity supplied to a change in price. A supply curve is said to be elastic when an increase in price increases the quantity supplied by a lot. And similarly, vice versa. That is, when a decrease in price decreases the quantity supplied by a lot, then we say that the supply curve is elastic. So when the quantity supplied is very responsive to the price, we say the supply curve is elastic. When the same increase in price increases the quantity supplied by just a little, then the supply curve is said to be inelastic. So when the quantity supplied doesn't vary very much with the price, the supply curve is inelastic. Here we show this on a graph. So consider the first curve, a $10 increase in price on this curve. Here's the $10 increase in price, increases the quantity supplied from 80 to 85 units. That is not by very much. On the other hand, on this more elastic supply curve, the same $10 increase in price increases the quantity supplied now from 80 units to 170 units. So you get a much bigger change in the quantity supplied from the same price increase when the supply curve is elastic compared to when it is inelastic. And again, as with demand curves, elasticity is not the same thing as slope. Nevertheless, when you have two curves which go through a common point, then the one which is flatter is more elastic at any given quantity. The one which is steeper is more inelastic. So we can always look at two curves and say this curve is more elastic than the steeper curve, and that will work for everything we're going to do in this class. So, what are the major determinants of the elasticity of supply? First, and most importantly, how do unit costs change with increased production? Second, the time horizon. Third, share of market for the inputs. And fourth, geographic scope. I'll explain each of these in turn. The main determinant of the elasticity of supply is how quickly per unit costs increase with an increase in production. In particular, if increased production requires higher costs, then the supply curve will be inelastic. It'll be steep if we're comparing two curves. On the other hand, if production can increase with constant cost or without increasing per unit costs very much, then the supply curve will be elastic. Let me give you two examples to make this clear. Compare the following two goods, Picasso paintings and toothpicks. Which has an inelastic supply and which an elastic supply? Okay, so let's think about an increase in price. For which good is it easier to expand production? For which good can you increase production at low cost without pushing costs up? Clearly, toothpicks. So an increase in the price of toothpicks, and you can make lots more toothpicks just by running an additional log down the sawmill. Many, many more toothpicks without an increase in costs. On the other hand, it's basically impossible to get an increase in the production of Picasso paintings. He simply isn't producing anymore. We may still have an increase in the market supply of Picasso paintings. Some people who have them in their homes will put them onto the market. But basically, the supply of Picasso paintings is highly inelastic. The price can go up and up and up and up, and you're not going to get very many more Picasso paintings. Once again, on the other hand, if the price of toothpicks goes up even a little bit, you're going to get a lot more toothpicks. So the supply of toothpicks is elastic, and the supply of Picasso paintings is inelastic. The time horizon influences the elasticity of supply for a good. And this is really just a logical consequence of the fact that elasticity depends upon costs and how easy it is to expand production. Immediately following a price increase, producers can expand production or output only by using their current capacity. So that tends to make supply more inelastic. So for example, if we're talking about grain production, if the price of grain goes up, well, farmers can get a little bit more grain out of their fields by threshing, by going over the fields more carefully, but they're not going to get a lot more until a year or two down the line, until after they've had a chance to plant more acres of grain. On the other hand, as I just said, over time, producers can expand their capacity. So in the short run, the elasticity of supply tends to be more inelastic because it's harder to expand output at the same cost. Over time, however, because producers can expand their capacity, the supply curve tends to be more elastic. So supply curves tend to be more elastic the more time you give producers to respond to the price. The elasticity of supply also depends on whether the good in question is a small or big demander in its input markets. That is, the industry's share of the demand for its inputs. Let me explain. Supply will tend to be more elastic when the industry is a small demander in its input markets, because then supply can be expanded without causing a big increase in the demand for the industry's inputs. Let's go back to the toothpick example. One of the reasons why toothpicks have an elastic supply is because we can easily double the supply of toothpicks and have just a tiny impact on the demand for wood, on the input into toothpicks. So we can double the supply of toothpicks, and since toothpicks are just a small user of wood, we don't require much more wood. So we're not going to increase the demand for wood very much when we increase the demand for toothpicks. Therefore, the price of wood is not going to be pushed up when we demand more toothpicks. Therefore, the quantity supplied of toothpicks can easily increase at the same price without increasing the cost of toothpicks. On the other hand, supply will tend to be inelastic when the industry is a big demander in its input markets. So again, suppose that the demand for automobiles were to increase. In order to expand the supply of automobiles, we need more steel. But automobiles are a big demander of steel. So when we want to increase the supply of automobiles, we're going to use a lot more steel. That's going to push up the price of steel. Therefore, that's going to increase the price of an input into making automobiles, which is going to push the price of automobiles up. Therefore, the supply of automobiles will tend to be more inelastic, because when we try and increase the supply of automobiles, we're going to increase the price of steel. That increases the cost of producing automobiles. The geographic scope of the market is another determinant of the elasticity of supply. In particular, the narrower the scope of the market, the more elastic the supply. The wider the scope of the market, the less elastic the supply. For example, suppose that the demand for gasoline increases in Washington, D.C. Say more people are moving to the D.C. region. Well, that demand can easily be supplied by taking a little bit of gasoline from elsewhere in the country, and we can increase the supply of gasoline in Washington, D.C. very easily without pushing up the price of gasoline hardly at all. On the other hand, if the worldwide demand for gasoline went up, say because China is becoming richer, India is becoming richer, they're buying more automobiles, well, in that case, we're going to have to dig for more oil. We're going to have to search for more oil. That's going to be much more expensive to increase the supply of gasoline to the world than it is to increase the supply of gasoline to Washington, D.C. Again, both of these are simply a reflection of the fundamental idea. Does an increase in the supply of a good, does that require a big increase in the cost of producing the good? So it's very easy to increase supply in Washington, D.C. or in a particular state and so forth. It's much more difficult to increase the total supply. Okay, let's summarize. What makes a supply curve more elastic? Fundamentally, a supply curve will be elastic when it's easy to increase production at constant unit cost, or when it's easy to increase production without increasing the unit cost very much. Supply curves tend to be more elastic than in the long run compared to the short run. They tend to be more elastic when the good has a small share of the market for its inputs, so it doesn't raise the price of its inputs when the market expands. And goods tend to be more elastic when we're just talking about the local supply of a good rather than the global supply, which tends to be less elastic. The elasticity of supply is defined as the percentage change in the quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in the price. So that's exactly the same as for the elasticity of demand, with the exception being that instead of talking about the quantity demanded, we're talking about the quantity supplied. In mathematical notation, the elasticity of supply is the percentage delta for percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in the price. Here's an example. If the price of cocoa rises by 10% and the quantity supplied increases by 3%, then the elasticity of supply for cocoa is. So elasticity, percentage change in quantity supplied, that's 3%, divided by the percentage change in the price, 10%, so the elasticity must be 0.3. Here's our midpoint formula. Again, practically the same as that for the elasticity of demand, only we're dealing with the quantity supplied rather than the quantity demanded. So the percentage change in quantity supplied is the change in quantity supplied divided by the average quantity times 100. The percentage change in price is the change in price divided by the average price times 100. The hundreds cancel out. So we're left with this formula where the change in quantity is quantity after minus quantity before over the average quantity. Price after minus price before over the average price. Let's do an example. At the initial price of $10, the quantity supplied is 100. When the price rises to 20, the quantity supplied is 110. So let's remember our formula, change in quantity over average quantity, change in price over average price. So the quantity after is 110, the quantity before is 100, so the change in quantity is 110 minus 100. This is the average quantity. The change in price is 20 minus 10. Just make sure that since we started here with the quantity after being 110, that's associated with the price after of 20, so put the 20 first. 20 minus 10 is 10 over the average price, etc., etc., etc. You can calculate the numbers, and what you find is the elasticity is 0.143. As with the elasticity of demand, if the elasticity of supply is less than 1, the supply curve is said to be inelastic. If it's greater than 1, the supply curve is said to be elastic. If it's equal to 1, said to be unit elastic. Okay, that's it for the mechanics of the elasticity of supply. What we're going to do next is applications of the elasticity of supply. This is an extremely important part of the course, so make sure you do follow the applications. Learning how to apply these ideas in the real world, showing what the real world consequences of these different elasticities are, is extremely important. That's what we're going to do next, and that will bring us back to that question we asked at the very beginning. How can we analyze something like the redemption of slaves, whether this is going to be a good policy or a bad policy? The elasticity of supply turns out to be critical to understanding that question. That's what we're going to look at next. Thanks.
Ready? So, Emory University introduced that supply elastic and supply inelastic, but this scenario can also be viewed in at the extremes where supply can be perfectly price inelastic. That is, price changes have no effect at all on quantity supplied. A perfectly inelastic supply curve is illustrated by a straight vertical line. On the other hand, supply can be perfectly price elastic. That is, any amount will be supplied at the prevailing price. So a perfectly elastic supply curve is a straight horizontal lines, just like the demand elasticity. What determines supply elasticity? So two important factors can be identified. First is time, and second, time horizon involved with which production can be increased. So time is a determinant of supply elasticity as producers respond to change in prices from time to time, given a certain period. So some producers change the number of supply of their commodities depending on the movement of prices with the shift from time to time. Also, the degree of responsiveness of supply changes in price is affected by the time horizon involved in the production process. So in short run, supply can only be increased in response to an increase in demand or price by working on the firm's existing plant more extensively. But this usually adds only marginally to total market supply. Hence, in the short run, the supply curve tends to be price inelastic. Why? Because when the price of a particular product increases, the immediate response is that current producers produce more of their product in their existing production facilities, like in their factories, stores, and offices. So although higher price will certainly introduce firms to produce more, the response is limited by the limited capacity of the firm's production facilities. So in the long run, firms are able to enlarge supply capabilities by building additional plants and by extending existing ones so that supply conditions in the long run tend to be more price elastic. Moreover, new firms can enter the market, so there will be a large response in the long run. As time passes, supply becomes more elastic as more and more new firms have time to build production facilities and produce more output. Again, my name is Loreto Atamosa, your instructor for microeconomics. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye!